In the autumn of 1907, the town of Ludington existed in a state of practiced familiarity with loss. Men vanished on the lake often enough that grief had developed a routine. Bells, prayers, watchful silences along the pier, and eventually, resignation. The water took. The water returned what it chose. Most of the time it returned nothing at all. That is why Ned Mallory's return disrupted something deeper than expectation. It was not simply unusual, it was incorrect. The official ledger of Mason County records his reappearance with minimal ceremony. Date, name, condition. The phrase, "found alive," appears nowhere else in that book, beside an entry involving Lake Michigan. That absence of precedent mattered more than anyone could articulate at the time. Ned was discovered shortly after dawn on October 9th, seated on the narrow strip of sand south of the breakwater, his back to the lake. A fisherman named Otis Kern, who had gone down early to check his nets, later testified that at first he thought the figure was debris, wreckage shaped like a man. Only when the figure moved did Kern understand he was looking at someone alive. Ned did not wave. He did not call out. He did not ask for help. Kern said later that what unsettled him most was not the man's condition, but his posture. Ned sat upright, legs drawn in slightly, hands resting flat on his thighs, as if he were waiting to be spoken to, or as if he had been sitting there for a long time, rehearsing something he had decided not to say. Kern offered his coat. Ned accepted it without comment. When Kern asked where he had come from, Ned answered only, "The lake." That was the first answer he gave. It would also be the last that carried any detail. At the sheriff's office, the process unfolded with mechanical politeness. Forms were produced. Questions were asked in the order they had always been asked. Names were written down. Mallory, Edward, age 32, occupation, telegraph operator, residence, transient lodging house. The questions then moved as they always did to the others. How many were with you? Who were they? When did you last see them? To the first, Ned answered clearly, 3. To the second, he gave names without hesitation, Thomas Rourke, Harold Venn, Silas Avery, as if reciting something memorized long before. To the third, he paused. This pause is described differently in each account. Sheriff Kessler remembered it as confusion. The deputy remembered it as calculation. A clerk who happened to be in the room remembered it as something closer to grief. But grief held under pressure, like breath. Finally, Ned said, before it was decided, Kessler asked what "it" meant. Ned did not answer. Instead, he said the sentence that would define the rest of his life in public memory. "I won't talk about the lake." It was not said loudly. It was not said defensively. It was said the way a man states a rule that already exists. Kessler tried again. He rephrased. He softened. He invoked responsibility, families, necessity. When that failed, he invoked authority. Ned listened to each attempt with the same stillness. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried no challenge. "I understand why you're asking," he said. "I just won't do it." The report records this as non-compliant. The margin bears a small notation, likely added later. Subject appears lucid. Lucid was the word everyone used in the beginning. It was comforting. Lucidity implied choice, and choice implied that silence was temporary, that eventually, once rest had done its work, the story would emerge. But days passed, then weeks. The doctor who examined Ned noted dehydration, abrasions, and muscle fatigue consistent with prolonged exposure. There were no head injuries, no fever, no delirium. When asked to recount events for medical purposes, Ned refused just as calmly as he had refused the sheriff. The doctor later said that what troubled him was not the refusal itself, but the consistency of it. Ned did not avoid certain questions and answer others. He did not offer fragments. He did not circle the subject and retreat. He simply would not cross a line. This made him difficult to categorize. In a time when suffering was expected to perform itself, when widows wept publicly and survivors testified as proof of catastrophe, Ned offered no performance at all. The town filled the absence for him. Some said there had been a fight. Others said there had been a bargain made, 3 for 1. A few whispered about cowardice, about a man who had found a way to save himself and let the others go. But these rumors relied on an assumption Ned never confirmed, that survival required betrayal. Those closest to the missing noticed something else. Ned did not defend himself. He did not correct exaggerations. He did not argue when people implied guilt. He accepted suspicion with the same restraint he had shown to authority. Mrs. Rourke, Thomas's wife, confronted him once outside the boarding house. Witnesses recalled her voice rising, breaking, demanding to know how her husband had died. Ned listened. When she finished, he said only, "I'm sorry." Not, "I'm sorry he died." Not, "I'm sorry I survived." Just, "I'm sorry." When she struck him, he did not raise his hands. This passivity was misread by many as indifference. But the boarding house landlady, Mrs. Hawthorne, later offered a quieter observation. She said Ned paid his rent early, ate little, and spent long periods sitting in the dark with the lamp unlit, staring at nothing. Once, she said, she heard him speaking softly in his room, not praying, not arguing, simply naming things as if checking them off a list. Water, rope, light. She never asked him what he meant. The historian encounters here the first crucial tension. Silence as absence versus silence as containment. The town wanted a story that would return order, a storm, a miscalculation, an accident. Any narrative that would allow the dead to be mourned properly and the living to be sorted into innocence or blame. Ned offered none, and so his return, rather than closing the event, prolonged it. The disappearance did not end when he came back. It merely changed shape. What survives in testimony from these first weeks is not horror, but frustration. People describe feeling owed clarity, owed grief with edges, owed a lesson that could be passed on. Ned gave them nothing but himself, alive, walking the same streets, carrying a knowledge he would not distribute. In later years, some would say that this was when the lake claimed him, not physically, but socially, that his refusal marked the moment he stepped out of the shared world. But that interpretation assumes that speech is always an act of connection. The documents suggest another possibility, that Ned believed speech would be an act of harm, and that his survival imposed a responsibility not to explain, but to protect, though what he believed he was protecting, and from whom, remains deliberately unstated. At the end of October, with no bodies recovered and no testimony forthcoming, the case shifted from emergency to record. The men were listed as presumed drowned. The search was called off. The town moved on unevenly. Ned did not. He remained quiet and intact, like a sealed envelope everyone could see and no one could open. And this is where the historian must pause, not to speculate, but to mark the boundary Ned himself established. The story begins not with what happened on the lake, but with what happened after. A man returned carrying a truth he believed was too dangerous, too heavy, or too corrosive to release. The question is not why he survived, it is why he chose silence as the cost of that survival. To understand the weight of Edward Mallory's silence, the historian must step backward, not toward the lake, but toward the ordinary. What the testimonies make clear is that nothing about the 4 men suggested rupture. There were no feuds, no whispered resentments, no signs of fracture that might later explain why 1 returned and 3 did not. In the weeks before their disappearance, they were simply men living inside the narrow rhythms of a lakeside town, preparing for winter. Ned Mallory had arrived in Ludington the previous spring, transferred by the telegraph company to relieve an older operator whose hands had begun to shake. He was quiet but not withdrawn, precise without being rigid. Several townspeople remarked on his patience, how he listened fully before answering, how he never interrupted, how he seemed to weigh words before releasing them. This quality made him useful in a place like Ludington, where messages often carried bad news, delayed ships, lost cargo, sudden illness. He did not soften the words, but he delivered them without drama. People trusted him because he did not perform concern. He simply conveyed what was. Thomas Rourke first spoke to Ned over the wire, asking about a shipment delayed by weather. Later, he spoke to him in person, offering thanks and eventually conversation. Rourke was the kind of man who made connections easily, broad-shouldered, quick to laugh, confident that most problems could be resolved by standing close enough to someone and speaking plainly. Harold Venn joined the circle later, younger than the others, meticulous, still saving money in labeled envelopes. He admired Ned's calm and Silas Avery's experience, and he admired Rourke because everyone did. Silas Avery was the outlier. He had sailed the lakes when he was younger, before engines replaced sails and before charts grew more precise. He had survived storms that later men only heard about. By 1907, he had sworn off the water except in small, practical doses, ferries, short crossings, nothing ambitious. That he agreed to go out again at all would later be treated as suspicious, but the testimonies suggest something simpler. Silas trusted the men. They met most evenings at McCall's dockside tavern, not to drink heavily, but to sit close to the stove and talk. The conversations remembered by witnesses are unremarkable. Weather, wages, rumors of better work inland. Once, someone recalled, Silas spoke about how the lake had changed. "People think it's tamer now," he said, "because we understand it better." Ned reportedly replied, "Do we?" Silas smiled at that, not dismissively, thoughtfully. It is tempting, from a distance, to read this exchange as foreshadowing, but at the time it was simply talk. What matters is that no one recalled tension, no raised voices, no debts unpaid, no argument that might later harden into motive. The decision to go out on the lake was not sudden. It emerged gradually, almost casually. A small repair job, a short crossing to check a mooring line, something that could be done quickly, before winter closed the water entirely. Ned was not a lake man. This is important. He did not grow up reading the water. He relied on others for that knowledge, and those others, particularly Silas, had earned his trust. On the morning of October 5th, they gathered near the dock just after sunrise. The air was cold but clear. No storm warnings had been posted. Several witnesses remembered the sound of the water that day as flat, a deceptive calm that old sailors sometimes mistrusted and younger men mistook for safety. They were seen laughing. This detail appears again and again, perhaps because it makes what followed harder to accept. Harold Venn's fiancée later said that he had kissed her twice before leaving, joking that if he didn't, the lake might get jealous. Rourke had promised his son he would be back before supper. Silas had brought an extra coil of rope, though no one could later remember why. Ned carried nothing unnecessary, just his coat, his gloves, and a small notebook he used for work. When asked later why he brought it, he said only, "Habit." The boat they used was not large, but it was sound, inspected, familiar. There was no indication of mechanical failure, no sign later of collision. They pushed off with the confidence of men who believed they understood the margins of risk. The historian must linger here, because this is where the narrative resists simplification. There is no evidence of recklessness, no singular error that explains everything. The event that followed did not arise from obvious incompetence or bravado. What the testimonies reveal instead is trust, quiet, accumulated trust. Trust in experience, trust in each other, trust in the assumption that if something went wrong, it would go wrong in a recognizable way. This is the world Ned Mallory stepped into that morning, a shared understanding of danger that felt manageable because it had names: storm, leak, engine failure. What no one had named, what no one could have named, was the kind of moment that would later force one man to choose silence as his only remaining action. Before the event, Ned was not a secretive man. He was not given to mystery. He lived openly, predictably, almost transparently. That transparency is what gives his later refusal its gravity, because whatever he carried back from the lake did not erase who he had been. It overrode it, and that suggests that the silence was not a continuation of his nature, but a correction imposed by something learned. The last confirmed sighting of the four men together shows them pushing away from the dock, the boat angling slightly east, the water dark but calm beneath a pale sky. Nothing in the record suggests that any of them believed this would be the last time they were seen alive. The separation did not announce itself. That is the most consistent conclusion drawn from the surviving fragments. No shout recorded, no sudden maneuver witnessed from shore, no signal flare seen by passing vessels. Whatever divided the four men occurred beyond the limits of observation, in a space where cause and consequence collapsed into something unreportable. The last external confirmation places the boat roughly 2 miles offshore by mid-morning. A steamer passing north noted it briefly. No distress, no erratic movement. Just a small craft on open water, its presence ordinary enough to be forgotten until later. After that, reconstruction depends almost entirely on inference. The historian must work with absence. No wreckage definitively tied to the boat, no bodies, no physical markers that would allow for a conventional narrative of disaster. And, crucially, no testimony from the only man who returned. Yet even silence leaves impressions. The doctor's examination of Ned Mallory revealed something telling. The abrasions on his hands were uneven. His right palm was torn more deeply than his left, the skin split in a way consistent with sustained friction rather than sudden injury. Rope burn, the kind that occurs when someone grips something moving under tension and refuses to let go. When asked how it happened, Ned said nothing. His boots, recovered later from the boarding house, showed a similar asymmetry. One sole was worn smooth at the edge, as if dragged repeatedly against a hard surface. The other was relatively intact. These details do not explain events, but they constrain them. They suggest duration. Whatever happened did not resolve itself quickly. It unfolded long enough for decisions to be made, reversed and made again. Long enough for hope to survive briefly, before being extinguished. The word separation appears in no contemporary document. It emerges only later, in the language of relatives and townspeople, attempting to describe the point at which expectation broke. Mrs. Venn described it this way: there must have been a moment when they were still together, and a moment after when they were not. That's where everything fell. The historian must be careful not to impose drama where there is only uncertainty. But certain facts are immovable. The men did not vanish simultaneously. If they had, debris would likely have marked the site. A sudden capsize, an immediate sinking, these leave signatures. None were found. Instead, what appears to have occurred is a gradual unraveling, a sequence of decisions under pressure, each one narrowing the field of survival without anyone fully recognizing the trajectory. This is where speculation becomes dangerous, and where Ned's silence becomes most significant. Because the absence of testimony does not erase the event, it concentrates it. Everything that cannot be spoken gathers weight. One detail, reported independently by 2 men who encountered Ned days later, deserves attention. Both said that when conversation drifted toward the moment, Ned's breathing changed. Not faster, but shallower, as if he were bracing for impact. One of them, a former sailor, asked him directly, "Was there a point where you knew?" Ned looked at him for a long time before answering. "There were several points," he said. "They just didn't look like that at the time." That is the closest he ever came to description. The phrase suggests multiplicity. Not one catastrophic instant, but a series of thresholds crossed quietly. Choices that seemed reversible until they were not. The separation, then, was not a single act. It was an accumulation. The historian can infer certain constraints. The water temperature that day was cold enough to shorten endurance, but not instantaneously fatal. Wind reports suggest a shift in direction around noon, subtle but persistent, enough to complicate return without making it impossible. In such conditions, men do not panic immediately. They assess. They argue gently. They defer to experience. Silas Avery would have been listened to. This matters. If Silas advised something that later proved wrong, the weight of that realization would have been immense. If he hesitated, if he deferred to younger men out of courtesy or fatigue, the consequences would have been just as heavy. Ned, as the least experienced, would have been the last voice consulted. And that may be the most important fact of all, because silence later often grows from guilt that cannot be assigned cleanly. Not the guilt of action, but the guilt of agreement, of going along. of not insisting. If Ned survived because he followed a plan that required others to do something else, something they could not sustain, then speaking would not clarify responsibility. It would distribute it. And distribution, in a town already wounded, might have felt indistinguishable from harm. No one knows how the physical separation occurred, whether a rope was cut or released, whether someone slipped, whether a decision was made that divided effort. One man to do one thing, another to do something else, all under the assumption that reunion was possible. But what is known is this: Ned did not describe himself as abandoned. When asked, months later, by a minister who believed confession could heal, whether he had been left behind or cast off, Ned answered, "No." That single word eliminates certain narratives. He was not a victim of the other's choices, which leaves only the more difficult alternative, that survival was not random, that it emerged from a structure of decisions whose logic made sense in the moment, and whose outcome made sense only in hindsight. This is the core of the separation, not distance, but divergence. The point at which shared intention fractures into parallel efforts that cannot be reconciled. By the time Ned reached shore, however that occurred, he was alone. That much is certain. He arrived without a boat, without tools, without explanation. But he arrived carrying knowledge that had been shaped by proximity to the other's final moments, and he chose to keep that knowledge contained. The separation then did not end on the water. It extended forward into the years that followed, defining every interaction, every refusal, every quiet moment when Ned could have spoken and did not. Because to speak would have required him to narrate not only what happened to the others, but what happened between them. In the immediate aftermath, Ludington behaved as it always had after loss. It organized itself around absence. Committees formed. Boats were volunteered. Names were read aloud in public spaces with the hope that repetition might summon what had not returned. But this time, there was a complication. Edward Mallory remained. His presence unsettled the town's usual choreography of grief. Survivors were meant to testify, to translate chaos into sequence so that others could absorb it. Ned refused this role entirely. He did not vanish into drink or rage. He did not flee. He simply withheld. The sheriff called him in again, weeks after the search had officially ended. This time the tone was different, less urgent, more strained. The bodies had not surfaced. Insurance claims were stalled. Families needed details, if only to satisfy forms. Kessler told Ned that silence was no longer neutral. Ned listened. When the sheriff finished, he asked a question of his own. "If I speak," he said, "will it bring them back?" Kessler answered honestly, "No." "Then it won't help," Ned said. "And it may do harm." "Harm to whom?" the sheriff asked. Ned did not answer. Pressure came from other directions. A lawyer representing the Venn family requested a formal deposition. Ned declined. A pastor requested private confession. Ned declined. A reporter suggested that silence made him appear guilty. To that, Ned replied, "Appearances don't drown." The town's patience thinned. Whispers hardened into opinion. Children were warned not to speak to him. Shopkeepers served him quickly and without warmth. His name, once unremarkable, became shorthand. That's him, the one who came back. Yet even as suspicion grew, something else persisted beneath it. Hesitation. No one could point to a lie. No one could say he contradicted himself. No one could accuse him of changing his story, because he had never offered one. Mrs. Hawthorne noticed changes in him as winter set in. He slept less. He walked long distances along the shore, never close to the water, always just far enough that he could hear it without feeling its pull. Once, during a heavy snowfall, she found him standing outside without a coat. When she scolded him, he said quietly, "I needed to feel how fast it works." She asked what worked. He shook his head. Never mind. The historian finds here a pattern that repeats in survivor silence. Selective proximity. Ned did not avoid reminders entirely. He approached them carefully, as if calibrating exposure. He allowed the memory to exist, but on his terms. That choice angered people. Grief, when shared, becomes communal property. Ned's grief remained private, and in doing so, it resisted the town's attempt to assign meaning. In February, the lake froze hard enough to walk on. People said it was a sign that if the water had hardened, it might give something back in spring. Ned did not go to sea. By March, the missing men were declared legally dead. Death certificates were issued without causes listed. Just a place, Lake Michigan. At the small service held for Silas Avery, the minister spoke of the unknowable. Ned attended, standing at the back. When the minister said, "Only one man knows what truly happened," several heads turned. Ned did not move. After the service, Silas's daughter approached him. She did not ask questions. She only said, "My father trusted you." Ned closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were wet but steady. "I know," he said. This moment appears in multiple accounts because it marks a shift. From that point on, people began to suspect that Ned's silence was not avoidance, but containment, that he was holding something intact because releasing it would fracture more than it would heal. Years passed. Ned left Ludington quietly, taking work inland where the sound of water did not follow him. He never married. He never returned to the lake. When interviewed decades later by a regional historian compiling oral accounts of lake disasters, Ned agreed to speak, on one condition: that we talk about everything except the lake. He spoke clearly about his life, his habits, his work, his memories of the men before that day. When the historian asked, finally, why he would not speak of the event itself, Ned answered with something close to finality. "Because the story belongs to the dead," he said, "and they can't correct it." He died in 1949. His papers contained no confession, no letter, no explanation, only a small notebook, water-stained, its pages blank. The aftermath, then, did not resolve into clarity. It hardened into acceptance, not of what happened, but of the fact that it would not be said. In the final accounting, history is often tempted to treat silence as failure, an absence of data, a refusal that leaves the archive incomplete. But when the historian returns to the case of Edward Mallory, again and again across years and methods, that interpretation proves insufficient. The silence does not behave like a void. It behaves like a structure. By the time the last surviving witnesses were interviewed in the 1950s, the town itself had changed. Ludington expanded, the docks modernized, new losses replaced old ones. Yet when Mallory's name was mentioned, the responses were strikingly consistent, not in content but in tone. People lowered their voices. They did not say he wouldn't talk so much as he didn't, as if speech had been an option consciously set aside, not a door that failed to open. The historian notes that no one ever recorded Mallory contradicting an established fact. He never denied the presence of the other men, never disputed the conditions, never suggested accident or fate or blame. He allowed all narratives to circulate without interference, including those that cast him in an unflattering light. This is unusual. Most survivors, even reticent ones, correct what they perceive as injustice. Mallory did not. He absorbed misinterpretation without protest. That behavior suggests a calculation. If one assumes that his silence concealed guilt, then logic would demand confession as relief. If one assumes it concealed cowardice, then speech might have reclaimed dignity. But Mallory chose neither relief nor redemption, which leaves only one remaining motive consistent with the evidence: protection. Protection of whom is deliberately unclear. The dead, certainly, whose final moments would become property the instant they were spoken. The living, perhaps, who would have to carry the knowledge once it was released, and possibly himself, not from blame, but from becoming a conduit through which something corrosive would spread. The historian must resist the urge to name that something, because Mallory himself resisted it. What can be said, without violating the logic of his silence, is this: the lake did not take the men all at once. It did not act as a singular force. It interacted with human judgment, human trust, and human limits, and Mallory survived long enough, close enough to understand how thin the margin truly was. Silence, in this context, becomes an ethical act, not the ethics of secrecy, but the ethics of containment, of choosing not to convert lived reality into narrative currency. When Mallory said, "The story belongs to the dead," he was not invoking sentiment. He was drawing a boundary between experience and explanation, between what can be lived and what can be responsibly told. The blank notebook found among his belongings reinforces this interpretation. It was not an omission, it was a decision preserved to the end. He could have written, he chose not to. In historical work, endings are often constructed by revelation. Here, the ending is refusal, and it holds. The disappearance remains unresolved not because evidence is missing, but because the only witness declined to become a narrator. And so the final act of the story is not loss, nor survival, nor guilt. It is restraint. Edward Mallory escaped the lake. What he refused to release never did.